Poetry stresses me out, so I called in the expert. All right, let's go. Hey, if you're new to the channel and you're looking for interviews with authors, illustrators, teachers, and librarians, the latest and greatest in children's literature, click that subscribe button down below. If you click the bell notification, you'll get an email every time I post. I don't know about you, but teaching poetry for me is super stressful. I don't feel confident, I get stressed, I want to do well, I'm worried that the kids are going to ask questions and I have no idea what the answer is, and I'm not going to be able to figure out the answer. Teaching poetry stresses me out. So I called in an expert. I asked Laura Salas, hey, what tips do you have for a teacher like me who stresses out when it's time to teach poetry? And you know what? After watching her answer, I'm a little less stressed, a little more confident, and a little excited to teach poetry. Check out what she has to say.
What tips do I have for teachers who are super stressed out about teaching poetry? Okay, my biggest number one tip is all about attitude. Poetry is a lot more afraid of you than you are of it. And you have the power to nurture or to squash poetry in your classroom. So don't be afraid of it, embrace it. Know that your role doesn't have to be knowing how to take apart a poem and telling your students the right answer about what this poem means or something. Your role can really be a guide who's going along with your students and discovering a poem and thinking about what it means and deciding what it means for you, which might be totally different than what the poet meant when he or she wrote it. So a few specific tips for teaching poetry in your classroom. Reading anthologies is awesome. Anthologies are books that are collections of poems by a lot of different poets. And so you get to hear this wide variety of voices represented and different moods and different poetic forms. So anthologies are awesome. And then when you find a poet who has a poem or two in there and you really love those, you can go see if they have complete collections of their own that you might want to bring into your classroom as well. Read current poetry books. Yes, there is, of course, much to be said for the poetry of the past, but if you really want to connect with poetry and you want your kids to connect with poetry and grow to love it, reading poems that are written recently or today, those poems are more likely to connect with what your own students are going through. Read poems more than once. Poems are jam-packed with content, with language or wordplay. They're really dense with meaning a lot of times. And so by reading them or sharing them more than one time, you give kids the opportunity to get more out of it. So just like students will, watch the same movie over and over again if they're allowed to, and they don't get tired of it, poetry is so short. And if you can share it several times, they're going to get more out of it every time. And you could share it different ways, like reading it out loud to them, posting it on the wall in your classroom, having kids read it out loud. So just letting them see it and hear it in different forms is awesome. Engaging your students in active poetry listening and reading is great. So kids can do sound effects. They can act out motions to a poem. You can turn a lot of poems into poems for two voices and divide up your class and let the students go back and forth reading that poem. Students can bring in props that go with certain poems. So there are all sorts of ways that you can get kids involved in reading poetry so that they will kind of take a little more ownership of it and it will sink in a little bit more. Tying poetry into content areas is also fabulous. There's a lot of poetry written that ties into different historical or social studies topics, to science, to math even, to physical education, to art, to music. There are poems that tie in with all your other content areas. And if you draw poems into other areas with your students, not just confining it to reading time or language arts time, you help them see that poetry is about the whole world, and you help them connect language and some of these content areas, and it gives them different ways to think about the facts that you're studying in other subject areas. I think the best tip is to know that you don't have to be right, that there isn't a right answer when it comes to a poem. So your job as teacher isn't to hold all those answers and to parcel them out to students and be able to answer every one of the questions that your students have even about a poem. Instead, your role can be one of helping to discover, along with the students, you're helping them discover and you're helping yourself discover a poem, and you're creating the meaning of that poem. Because with a lot of poems, if the meaning is not crystal clear, then you as the reader get to decide what it means. And always, no matter how simple or sophisticated a poem is, you get to decide what you like about it and what you don't like about it. And you and your students can discover things inside poems. You can look for similes and metaphors and onomatopoeia and all those great things. But you can also just look for, what do I like here? Which line made me feel something? How do I feel at the end of this poem? What does it remind me of in my own real life? All these are great questions to talk about with kids while reading a poem, and there's no right or wrong answer. I always recommend that as teacher, you hold your opinion about whether you kind of like the poem overall or not until the very end of the discussion, so that your people pleaser students don't just parrot whatever you say. But it's totally okay to not like every poem you share. If you're sharing a great variety of poems so that you can reach all your different students, you probably aren't going to like all your poems. And that's a good thing. Poetry evokes kind of an emotional response, and we're all going to respond differently to different poems. So if you create an atmosphere in your classroom where that is celebrated, then you are well on your way to helping students discover poems they love, even your students who may not be super eager readers. My last tip is about rhyme. It's for writing poetry. And I will just say that kids love to rhyme. It's fun to play with rhyme, and I will do certain rhyming exercises with students to kind of warm up and have some fun. But the sooner you can leave rhyme behind and get them writing about things that matter to them and concentrate on language and emotion or facts if you're writing about a content area. But the sooner you can get away from rhyme dictating the poem, the more wonderful the poetry will be. So kids can write incredible poetry, but almost never incredible rhyming poetry. I think that's it. I hope those tips are helpful. My one question for you is, what part of yourself are you keeping hidden away from people? What part of yourself are you a little bit ashamed of or uncertain how that will be received? And it's really a two-part question. And is there a way you can start revealing that part of yourself to your colleagues, to your students, maybe through your own writing? But how can you start revealing that part of yourself that you've been keeping hidden? So that's something I've thought about a lot lately, and so I'm passing that challenge along to you.
You know what? I think I can teach poetry now. Feeling pretty good. Feeling pretty confident. Even a little excited. I can do this. leave a comment below. I want to see your answer to Laura's important question. Thank you so much for tuning in. If I can do anything to help you at any time, just leave a comment on any of these videos or send me an email, colbysharp@gmail.com. Thanks for tuning in. Stay awesome. Happy reading.